Welcome to a new episode of Skin in the Game. I'm your host, John Cimperman, with my co-host,
Tim O'Shei.
Tim, how are you doing today?
Doing well.
This summer, millions of fans came to North America to enjoy the FIFA World Cup. It was a great experience for many fans, and this week's episode we'll do a little bit deeper dive into hopefully the outcomes of all these visitors.
Yeah, now John, that they restocked all the beer in Boston.
In Boston, we can go back.
Now it's time, since the crowds are home, it's time to figure out, what did the World Cup actually mean? Like, was it everything that cities and taxpayers were promised? There were some big promises out there, and did the economic benefits match what were some pretty big investments by cities around the entire continent?
Right.
And the legacy, what does it mean? Will the legacy remain?
Yeah. So today we're going to have a great episode that's going to look at kind of the impact of the FIFA World Cup from two different perspectives. Angela Lee, who is a business professor at Columbia University, was really in the middle of it in New York City, and going to talk about kind of the infrastructure, but also a lot of qualitative perceptions that came out of the games. And actually, Tim, how it also might kind of warm the oven, if you will, for New York hosting another big games.
I know a certain governor, right. Kathy Hochul, who's going to appreciate what Angela Lee has to say.
And then we're going to go talk to our friends up north in Toronto. We have Josh Rubin, who is a business reporter from the Toronto Star, who's going to do more of a deeper dive and I guess more of the quantitative impact of FIFA World Cup. And if you know the GTA and actually Ontario province invest about $380 million to bring the World Cup to Toronto. So we want to see and hear from Josh on how that may have a lasting impact on the economy. Or not.
Yeah. And here, let me do a little teaser for folks, John. Would you rather have the World Cup or Taylor Swift, if you care about economic impact?
Stay tuned, right?
Stay tuned for that one.
Well, let's get started with Professor Angela Lee from Columbia University. Angela, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
So you've been in the middle of it, that being the World Cup for 5-6 weeks. So we did want to touch a little bit on your perspective on the impact or the potential benefit of the World Cup. But before that, Angela, just hope you could give our viewers and our listeners a little bit of your background, both at the Columbia Business School, as well as a little bit on 37 Angels.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I wear a couple of hats. I mostly teach venture capital at Columbia Business School, and I'm also the faculty director of our entrepreneurship sector. And then outside of Columbia, I run 37 Angels. I founded it 13 years ago, and we do two things. The first is we invest in startups. So we've looked at over 20,000 startups and invested in over 120. And the second thing we do is we teach people how to invest in startups. So we have an investing boot camp that teaches people how do you invest in your very first startup.
We do a lot of discussion here on this program about the investments today, private equity in many cases, jumping into professional sports or sports startups. Have you seen anything trending in things that pass your desk?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest area that we're looking at, so we used to call it gaming, right? And so not necessarily directly the gaming platforms, but how do we help fantasy sports player make better decisions, gamers make better decisions? And then more recently, they're of course being called prediction markets. And so we've seen a lot in that space. It's fascinating, not just from an investment perspective, but from a regulatory perspective and a human perspective.
Have you worked with athletes who are interested in startup investing?
We have. We've had a number of athletes come through our program, and we're actually in discussions with athletic group to talk about how do we make this more of something outside of venture capital. I also teach personal finance at Columbia Business School. And so how do you think about just managing your finances overall? Because as we all know, a lot of athletes make a lot of money, but they also can burn through it very quickly. Right. So how do you think about investing as a portfolio, and startup investing being one small piece of that?
Not our topic for today, but I think John and I
could talk about that for hours.
Well, that's where I'm going with this. So could I, and John, I'm sure you could too. Yes. We're going to circle back on that one at some point. But World Cup just ended.
Yes.
You're in New York City or in the New York City area. So, of course, was the World Cup. big picture, what was the experience like being there? What was the immediate impact while you were, living and working in the midst of it?
It's funny because I remember when we all found out that the World Cup was coming to the tri-state area, and I'll be honest, the immediate reaction was groans. I think New Yorkers are trained from a very young age to hate tourism and to hate anything that's going to disrupt our daily commute. And so I think in general, people initially just thought of more traffic. And it was really cool to watch over the last few months and then weeks how that has really turned to excitement. I live in Columbus Circle and I'm right by the Deutsche Bank, and there is a FIFA countdown clock there. And it was 100 days to the World Cup. And I literally walk by every single day, and to see people from all over the world stand next to it and take photos, like you just cannot help but to be infected by that excitement. So it's been really, really cool to watch that transformation from my most like curmudgeon of friends to they're like screaming and really excited about these games.
That's what we've kind of experienced too, because months back on our program, we kept hitting on the negative headlines, the potential transportation issues, the cost of tickets, some of the fan festivals, which were at one point free to fans, were either being eliminated or now charging fans. There was a lot of negative PR coming out before the games. But once the ball hit the pitch, it seemed like the whole attitude and the whole perception changed. So as far as transformational change, right, and innovation that might be driven out of experiences like the World Cup, are there things that you're hearing or seeing about, what the legacy or the innovation that could be driven from these games?
Absolutely. I think that big world events really force innovation, but they also give innovation this worldwide platform to either succeed or fail. And so I think this World Cup in particular, people were talking a lot about using AI to recognize offsides, right? And while that technology has existed prior to the World Cup, the fact that it got this grand stage, I think was really unique. We all hear about these really fast bullet trains in Tokyo. Those were created for the Tokyo Olympics, right, in 1964. Literally, like the first train ran the day before the Olympics started. And it's because these events force that type of innovation.
People in our country are so dependent upon the automobile and parking next to a stadium. Just wondering if there were any maybe positive behavioral changes that may have come from transportation in and out of what now is again known as MetLife Stadium.
These sorts of events are stress tests, right? And they're stress tests with no dress rehearsal, which can be really scary. But I think to your point, like everybody was so worried going into it, and then not a blip, right? We haven't heard these crazy headlines of traffic jams or trains getting stuck or trains getting crowded and people not being able to get on. And I think it's because everybody planned really well, and we heard nary a blip around anything related to transit, because I do think there was a lot of preparation going into it.
And Angela, I was just going to ask you what went well. So as you pointed out there, the planning was clearly effective. Let's drill down on that though. Like, what could have been some of the breaking points that didn't break, and what did you see going really well?
I think communication was really good ahead of time, that people knew when games were. And I think there was talk about maybe we don't fly out of a certain airport at a certain time. But I think the contra example is Taylor Swift concerts, which I don't know how many of you dealt with them. I don't even know when the era
Yeah. I
Okay.
have some familiarity.
Personally?
Parentally, but yes.
Parentally, okay. It's okay.
I'm well aware. I'm well aware.
That I think was the contra example where absolutely you saw the Instagram reels and the posts afterwards where people just could not either exit a stadium, get onto public transit. And we just heard none of those stories. And I think it was due to good communication. And even I think when there was a long line, I do feel like people took it pretty well. And that was also nice to see, like the positive energy around it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. Like if there's any place, off the top of my head in North America, or at least in the United States, that would be equipped to handle massive amounts of people on public transportation, it would be New York, New Jersey, because people are already doing it anyway. If they had all tried to drive, which might be what happens at a Taylor Swift concert, people in the tri-state area were already conditioned by lifestyle to make this work.
Absolutely. I think this is one of those weird situations where you almost want to hear like these crazy success stories, but it's definitely a situation of no news is good news in this case.
Yeah. Oh, for
Right.
sure.
We're still not going to know, at least in the short term, what the kind of the final economic impact was for the U.S. or specifically New York, New Jersey. Everything I read, Angela, the state, the cities invested roughly $500 million to put on the games. There's hopes for a multiple of that in economic return. So we'll see and we'll follow it, Tim. But I think one thing we can say, and this is more qualitative, and I kind of think it's kind of fun, is let's just say the U.S. was in need of a little bit of a positive PR campaign, right?
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically, if we wanted the U.S. to look good to the rest of the world.
And Angela, I don't know if you've heard the stories or witnessed whether it's the Scottish coming in and drinking all the beer in Boston,
Yeah.
or the Norwegians, rowing down the streets of New York. Or what I love is how many things we in this country take for granted, whether it's a Costco or a Chipotle salad bar. The folks that came in from other countries, they kind of fell back in love with the U.S. And I think that's a qualitative result that is tough to put a number on.
It's interesting because I couldn't help but to come up against like my YouTube feed, my Instagram feed of stories of people like America's free water, unlimited bread refills. Look at how large this beverage is. A lot of people were going to Buc-ee's, which is this like,
Oh
amazing
yeah,
gas station.
that's like Disney World, right? Yeah.
I mean, speaking of Disney World grocery stores, like I think, we have these huge grocery stores, but and not only I think was it positive PR for the rest of the world to come, and people were calling it the Great American Sleepover, which I really liked. But I think it also helped Americans appreciate, to your point, these things that we take for granted. And I do think that I think we needed a little bit of positive PR, not just externally, but within our own country. And it was really great to see people share these stories about like, look at all these things that we should be proud of. And it really felt like the world came together for a really nice moment.
I've got some good friends in Germany, and they've been hesitant for quite some time now to come to the United States. And when I asked them why, they said, well, look at everything that's happening there. And they were talking about law enforcement issues, ICE, videos of ICE agents, violence, things like that. Not to dig into that topic here, but that seemed to me anecdotally to be the impression people have had for a while now of what is going on in the United States. And now the videos are big celebrations out in the grass in the stadium. What's happening outside the stadium? Partying, celebration. Yes, Costco and Buc-ee's and things like that. Have you heard from people whose perceptions switched because they came here and saw that there's a lot more to the U.S. than what those videos show?
100%. My husband dances Argentine tango. And as you can imagine, it's been an exciting several weeks for that group. And what's particularly interesting is, we're based in New York, and we always talk about how America's melting pot, New York City in particular, is so international. And this just really highlighted how international of a city it is. This group that dances Argentine tango, by the way, most of them are not from Argentina. Many of them said, I'm now going to make a trip to the US because of the things that I've heard. Or I know of a couple of families where, like, the dad came, but they didn't want to bring their family because they're like, it feels a little bit maybe unsafe to come. Those two dads in particular both said, I wish I brought my family and we're going to organize another trip next year, because I just didn't know that the feeling of like welcome, the feeling of safety, the feeling of joy, I think it really like infected the world in a really lovely way.
And Tim, we preach on this program all the time. That is the power of sport, is bringing people together from different backgrounds, right? And what I loved about the World Cup is, unlike the Olympics, which I still love, but that focuses on one city, one market, right? So obviously 2028 Los Angeles. But what this did is it introduced people to a city like Kansas City, right? which by the way, from everything I've heard, Kansas City was a very welcoming community with a strong soccer history. So that was nice about the games is, both Canada and the U.S., as well as Mexico, had a chance to share in that. And so many of those fans who traveled overseas got to get different tastes of different markets and different cities and different cultures, for that matter. So, Angela, I just wanted to kind of segue, because in your background with building brands and helping athletes kind of leverage their popularity. Are there any recommendations or anything that you see or you would predict as far as some of these soccer players being able to really leverage their brand popularity and obviously the spotlight that's been on them for the last 5-6 weeks?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time. We've done a fair amount of work with, celebrities and influencers, and obviously those analogies very much hold true for athletes as well. And we talk about the three R's, being reach, reputation, and relevance. Reach makes sense, right? How many people are following you on Instagram or are really like listening to you and caring about what you say? The second one is reputation. I think the bar for this has just gotten so much harder over the last few years. I feel for these celebrities and these athletes because everything they do, every second of what they say is on camera. The fact that something they do, even when they're not on stage, when they're being with their families, is part of their reputation is really hard. And we've seen athletes like Tiger Woods and Lance Armstrong suffer from that. And so I always tell people who are making this decision, it is an active choice. Like, do you want to be a part of your brand or do you not? An analogy from my world is, OpenAI and Anthropic. If you look at those CEOs, I think everyone knows Sam Altman's name for this part. I don't know that a lot of people know Dario's name, who's the CEO of Anthropic, because he's chosen to be much more behind the scenes and like much more about the tech. And then the final thing is relevance, right? So how do you turn that brand into something that is relevant? And an example that might date me a little bit is like the George Foreman grill is such a good example of something that made a ton of sense for him to advocate for this, the George Foreman grill. But you see a lot of celebrities and athletes doing things that don't make any sense for their brand, and they tend to not work so well.
And just kind of the final thing, and Angela, I think, when we look at sports investors and sports athletes now investing in sports, I mean, you're seeing athletes like Messi and before that, David Beckham, who have equity interests in Major League Soccer teams. That's a trend that probably started with David Beckham first. If you look at the top 20 athletes' salaries, believe it or not, it's LeBron James is up there and Steph Curry is up there. Mahomes is up there. But the top 3 to 5 are soccer players.
And there's a huge trend of athletes turning into investors as well. A lot of athletes are not only investing in sports leagues, but they're also investing in startups. And that's more where I kind of see folks.
Yeah.
But it is interesting how it's going to come full circle in that way.
I would agree. While the sports team investment is a little bit ego-driven, it's always nice to, own a little bit of a team. But the sports technology, those investments, I think that's... those have longer legs and maybe, a better return than investing in a sports team.
Especially if they lend their brand to the sports technology, right? That's a really nice way that athletes can get a huge ROI on their investment because if they don't just give their money, but they give their name, it's a really great way for them to invest in both sides.
Angela, when an athlete comes to you looking to you for guidance on where and maybe when and how to invest their money, I can imagine, yes, like some of those sports tech startups. But I also know, stepping outside of sports, that there are a whole lot of startups out there that certainly don't have the cachet of sports, but they're filling a real need, and they have exponential growth possibility, which of course is exactly what you want in a startup. So talk us a little bit about how you guide an athlete who has both money and a brand to lend in thinking through how they want to invest their money and also their energy.
I think the first word that comes to mind is focus, which is people get very excited, especially the first year of investing, where they want to invest in everything and they want to be on the board of everything. And we really encourage all investors and especially athletes to be really laser focused on where they want to give their time, their money, and their brand. So that's, I think, step number one. And we will often tell people just don't write a check for the first 6 months, right? Because every pitch is going to sound so exciting on day one. So that's the first thing, focus. And then the second thing is to separate the product from the company. I think a lot of the times people get really excited about the product, but if the team's not the right team, if they're not marketing the right way, if they don't have the right strategic partnerships, that is going to make something fail, even if the technology is the best technology in the world. And we really have to tell people to separate those two things.
Let me flip that around too for the founders of a startup who are looking for investors. How valuable is an athlete's pedestal branding and marketing power into it, that's something, a little bit different. So how do you look at the value of that?
So it goes back to the three R's of reach, reputation, and relevance. And I do find that sometimes we will see athletes maybe over-index on those, and the founder's like, "Ooh, actually, it's not maybe quite as valuable as the athlete could think." But when there's a match, it's such a perfect match. And then the other thing is, as founders, I'm a former founder. I'm now on the other side as an investor. But when you're a founder, you have a lot of people who are aggressively trying to help you, and that can be really, really overwhelming. And so we also tell founders that they have to set up boundaries of this is where I need help, but then I need you to not bother me about this scope of work. And setting those boundaries can be really tough when it's a famous soccer player that you've been following for the last 20 years of your life. And it can be harder to set those boundaries, but it's even more important to say, this is the lane that you can play in, but I really need you to stay out of these different arenas.
Angela, I want to ask you about Governor Kathy Hochul's initiative to try to bring the Winter Olympics to New York State, and she's looking at the New York City area and at Lake Placid. So we'll look at the state, or at least a big piece of the state, as one market. In what ways, if any, does New York, New Jersey's success, the tri-state area's success hosting the World Cup, help position that pitch, or at least position that pitch, if it's landed, to be successful in the way it's carried out?
I think that this was a really nice dress rehearsal for that, to say, look, we can do this in a really good way. And people think of the Olympics as being really huge, and it is. But if you actually look at per event attendance, it's actually not much larger than the finals of the World Cup. And so this was a very good stress test of that. So that's the one thing. But I do think that a learning that we've all made is that we can't just rely on this being a tourism play, right? Oh, hotels are going to do well, restaurants are going to do well, because I think some of that lift wasn't as high as we were expecting. But there are so many other players that did win. And so I think shifting the attention, not just from a pure tourism play to other ways to win, I think this is just a really good test of that.
And maybe, Tim, that lasting legacy for the Olympics back in New York is the bullet train from Manhattan to Lake Placid.
Oh, that would be nice. If they could get one from Manhattan to Buffalo. If there's a way.
Our train system needs some overhauling.
Yes. Well, but this goes back to what we were talking with you about, just earlier, was these events can be a catalyst for investments that have lasting positive infrastructure, right? Versus what we saw maybe in Sochi or other Olympics, where these facilities became just ghost towns after the event left. But in the case of what we saw in New York and hopefully other cities, there's some of these infrastructure improvements that now will last in those communities.
I hope so, right? Because humans hate to change. And one of the nice things about these events is they're forcing mechanisms, because urgency removes bureaucracy. I don't know how many of you have watched Project Hail Mary, but not to spoil the movie, but basically there's a disaster facing Earth, and then one person is put in charge of the world, and basically she's given full license to break every rule, right? And so, a more realistic example is what would have taken 17 committees and 87 signatures. That can be streamlined, and that is why these events are so important. And I think why government really welcomes them, because they are an impetus for change.
Well, Professor Angela Lee, Columbia Business School, I want to thank you for your insights into not only the World Cup's effect on New York, New Jersey, but also your insights into how some of these athletes and most recent soccer players can leverage their 3 R's to build brands and invest. And Tim, I do want to make sure we get Angela back on the program to talk a little bit more, go a little bit deeper on, how athletes can maintain their quality of life beyond their playing days. And I think that's something that's really important to be discussed, and we talk about it here quite often.
I'm sold on that idea. Angela, as I think you can see, I, like you, could go on about this absolutely all day. So if you're willing to come back, we'd love to have you back.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me, Tim and John.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Great conversation with Angela. And something, we just scratched on a little bit of that, kind of that private equity, and more importantly, kind of athletes investing in themselves and other brands. I really think we need to bring Angela back on the show soon.
we stuck to World Cup. But Angela would be the perfect person, John, to help us unpack what that looks like and what athletes can actually do with their money in a it's healthy, responsible way. It's tough.
Yeah, but it's a growing part of the sports business.
And it's a good problem to have, but it is a problem. And so Angela can walk us through what they do to coach those players.
And it was also great chatting with Angela about kind of those more qualitative success of the event of the World Cup. And I really continue to appreciate those stories of people's perceptions who came here from other countries of the U.S. to visit the U.S. And I think it's important, to look at the numbers, but also kind of the brand value metrics. And, how can that really maybe have a long tail and help us down the road?
And this, John, is where we bring in my people, the journalists. That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, seriously. I mean, journalists got to keep it real. We'll get into this with Josh, but navigating the economic impact of sports is trickier than it would seem because you can pull in hundreds of thousands of people for an event. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a huge economic impact that is lasting.
Or they're new people, right?
Yeah. And here's the basics of it to prime everybody. If you pull in a bunch of people for an event, did they just replace others who would have been there? Not a bad thing to have them, but it's not necessarily additive in a lasting way, right? So we're going to dig into that with Josh. And yes, we are going to answer that burning Taylor Swift question. Would you rather have the World Cup or Taylor Swift? And we'll find out, did the World Cup actually live up to the expectations that Toronto laid out for them? So let's bring on from the Toronto Star, Josh Rubin. So good to have you on Skin in the Game. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me here.
Oh, so happy to have you. So, all right. So John and I have been talking about the World Cup for weeks now.
Oh, I don't know. It seems
longer.
Like years we've been talking about the World Cup.
Yeah. And so we've been talking, especially here on the American side about some of the good things that have come from this. And that kind of stuff is, what have we talked about, John? Was it the Scots emptying Boston of all its beer?
Yes,
right.
And how so many of these international travels experienced Walmart and Buc-ee's for the first time, and we're enthralled by some of the casual fast food dining in the States. But more qualitative, I think, Tim, than really what was the quantitative results of the investment that that these cities made to host the World Cup. And I thought be great to get Josh's perspective on that.
Yeah, and Josh, your reporting caught our interest on this because you've done a great job at the Toronto Star, and thank you for doing this, of giving some well-reported early assessments of what the World Cup has and has not meant, in your case, to the GTA, to Toronto. So I'm just looking here at a piece you had the other day in the Star. The World Cup was projected to bring 300,000 visitors to Toronto, and some projections had the economic impact or economic output at 940 million Canadian. And of course, it's too early to say down to the dollar or the person what that actually turned out to be. But what are the early indications?
Well, I mean, the early indications are that it's a mixed bag, to put it as directly as possible. I mean, we've got some evidence that there's more spending by international visitors than there were at this time last year. But the flip side is that the overall spend in a lot of economic categories, if it is treading water. Only conclusion that you can draw from that is it's squeezed out domestic tourists. It's squeezed out a lot of business travelers. So is it bringing people here who wouldn't otherwise be here? Absolutely, no question. But is it overall having a positive impact on the economy? That's the rub of it. The early indications are not great.
And Josh, what was the investment that the GTA, invested in infrastructure and everything else to be awarded the World Cup?
Everybody gives slightly different answers with slightly different definitions. So, part of it is trying to compare, to get an apples to apples comparison. But most estimates are that it was 380 million to host the 6 games in Toronto. The city itself covered about 180 million of that. And then the federal government and the provincial government, kind of went roughly halvesies on the rest. Now, those are all Canadian dollars,
Sure.
just for your perspective, and that's about 270 million US.
Let's get into what was and wasn't happening in terms of the impact and the impact of those visitors. So something that people would look at is, well, yeah, it brought in, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who would not have otherwise been to Toronto. It brought them there. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
There is a flip side to that as well. So talk us through, how people can look at that.
It absolutely did. So, it got people, in some parts of downtown near the stadiums, there was, no question, there were bars and restaurants and, kind of like all the things that you associate, like some hotels, there were some that were quite busy. But I'm dating myself here, but I remember going to Expo 86 in Vancouver, mumble years ago. The expo site, kind of the few blocks around it were great. The rest of the downtown core was, there's some evidence that it was, very geographically uneven, in terms of where the spend was spread. So, and then the other question is, a lot of the sports bars, for example, they probably would have been busy if these games were played in Toronto or Timbuktu. There's direct evidence of that because, nights when, Mexico was playing in Mexico City, like I live in Little Italy and there's like a lot of really good sports bars and avid sports fans around here. These places were packed, even, yes, on Toronto game days, but they were packed on games that had nothing to do with Toronto. Would those places have been as busy, if the games were hosted somewhere else? Entirely possible.
I bring this up in a few of our shows, the substitution effect, right? Where you're taking dollars that are being spent elsewhere by a fan, right? And then in this case, moving them to this venue. And I think, Josh, you mentioned, some of these people were not necessarily maybe new money because people would still be traveling and visiting Toronto and still filling up those hotel rooms. But in some cases, there may have been travelers who were intimidated at whether the cost or the perception of traffic to come visit Toronto because the World Cup was going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And a point that Professor Victor Matheson has mentioned, and there's ample evidence of, is you look at Paris, the Paris Olympics. That's a city that knows a thing or two about tourism and tourists. During the Paris Olympics, all of the other big tourism sites were off by like 20-30% in terms of foot traffic. Is that traffic lost permanently, or did people just kind of, book around it, come in different parts of the summer? I think probably the draw to go to Paris is strong enough that they might have, gotten some aspect of that shifting, just kind of shifting it to other time periods. Now, I love my city of Toronto. Are we in the same tourism category as Paris and London? I think there are people who would beg to differ on that. So I don't know, that we got as many of those people coming back, and I'm not taking a shot at my own city. I'm proud to be from here, but, we don't have the Louvre, we don't have Versailles.
What I do wonder, though, is, put it this way. No, Toronto is, and I love, love, love Toronto. Toronto's not London. It's not Paris, but it's also not Kansas City either, right? And so I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this. I don't have any sense, but I wonder if
Tim, you just took a shot at Kansas City.
I would never do that. Never, never, never.
No,
I hear there's great barbecue.
Which one?
Great
one
barbecue.
Of the two?
Exactly. Which one? I heard there's great barbecue and decent football. I mean, I'm going to guess that you compare typical Toronto tourist numbers, say, to typical Kansas City tourist numbers, and Toronto's going to come out way, way, way on top.
It's tough to say. I mean, it would just be an educated guess, but I mean, I know that the hotel people were already talking about kind of like the last week of the tournament. They were seeing some evidence that the numbers were coming back up to where they would have expected to be. You get a little crumble of data here from one group and a little crumble of data from another group, and so you kind of try to piece it together, and that's still, I think we won't know the full picture, for months, on it, and to be completely honest. So
yeah, we're with Josh Rubin, business reporter, Toronto Star. Josh, we talked to Angela Lee, professor at Columbia in New York City.
Hmm.
A lot of her findings were, you know, yes, qualitative, a lot of, you know, look like happy tourists on the streets
Yeah.
of Manhattan. But the one thing she did mention as a positive for kind of that New York, New Jersey metro was, first of all, the fact that New York City could still host a major event because there are a
Mm.
lot of skeptics and a lot of
Mm.
negative PR before
Yeah.
the ball hit the pitch. But she also talked about kind of infrastructure improvements and how well, you know, the public rail, you know, transit worked and the fact
Yeah.
of how they got people to and from the games. It also potentially helps warm the oven for New York City and Lake Placid to at least put a bid in for the winter games, right? Because
Mm.
they were on the world stage. Is there any kind of infrastructure or any positives that or improvements that came out of these games that Toronto could potentially leverage down the road?
Not really in that kind of significant way. I know when we hosted the Pan Am Games in 2015, obviously different scale, both in terms of number of competitors, number of sports, and frankly, worldwide interest. There, at least we got the Union Pearson train, from the downtown kind of transportation hub out to the airport at Pearson International. We got that built. This time we really didn't get anything of that scale or significance built. So I don't want to say there was nothing because,
Mm-hmm.
there's, some sports infrastructure a little bit, but certainly nothing on the grand city building scale that, people associate with, like the Barcelona Olympics. They
Right.
got great, they really improved their modern telecoms and, kind of, cities which have world fairs, like in tend to improve their transportation or that type of thing. We didn't get any major new transit lines or major new bits of hard infrastructure here.
Well, I guess that leads me to the question then is where did this $380 million go to host the games? Is that stadium improvements or infrastructure?
Yeah,
Or?
I mean, some of it was stadium improvements. They kind of built on some temporary stadium improvements, and so like kind of took it up to like 50,000 and change seats. Was it worth it for temporary infrastructure improvements? That's a bit of a stretch when you're talking about long-term economic impact.
Yeah.
Like other than, the money for, people who actually build it and, like listen, all the power to them for building it, but that's not a long-term economic impact. Having an extra 20,000 seats in your stadium, that's not going to do a lot for, transit lines or, travel times on, Toronto area roads.
I want to go a little deeper here, Josh, on
Sure.
economic impact in sports because I'll give you an example. I covered the Buffalo Bills stadium
Hmm.
negotiations for the Buffalo News.
Yeah.
And oh my goodness, did I get an education in a couple of a couple of things. One is frankly when you're a journalist writing about economic impact, people are going to have a lot of opinions about you
Oh yeah.
and your work. And that was interesting to see. A lot of sports economists, and you mentioned Victor Matheson. I'm a huge fan of Victor Matheson. He's one of the straightest shooters,
Yeah.
I've met in the sport economics game. A lot of sports economists, fall in two categories. They're either fiercely independent, and
Yeah.
I put Victor Matheson in there, where they're going to tell you exactly what they think. And a lot of times it seems to come down to sports don't actually have a great economic impact. Or you get people on the other side who are hired by a sports team or a sports organization will show you exactly how wonderful the
Yeah.
economic impact of sports is. And I got to tell you, even as somebody who covered it, I'm not even sure where it all shakes out. So you've done this and you've done it for longer than I did. Like, kind of how do you make sense of it?
I've had some hard thinks about it too because like even colleagues say really how could there be this many people, how could we see filled bars and stadiums and it not have an impact, and it's like I'm not saying it doesn't have an impact. I'm just wondering, and I think there's evidence there to wonder whether it's worth the spend. And that's not me saying, and I'm sure you got some of this when you were asking the tough questions on on Highmark, but I got like the oh, you're a killjoy. Well, leave it to a journalist to to crap all over people having a good time. And it's like I've spent half my career in the sports department, so like I love it. I watched a ton of the games. Like my neighborhood was great. It was a real joy. It was a wonderful atmosphere to the city. For it brought a wonderful atmosphere, a wonderful vibe to the city. But when people make the cases for hosting these events, there's usually three prongs that they go by. One is economic impact, which is clearly questionable. It can vary, significantly from their projections. The other is infrastructure, which, as I've discussed, like we didn't really get a ton of infrastructure here. And the third one, and this is, on the marketing side, people talk about tourism marketing. It's like, destination marketing. That's fine theoretically, but a couple of points. One is here, this was split with 16 other places, right? So it's not like everybody who's tuning in is saying Toronto World Cup, Toronto World Cup, Toronto World Cup, right? Like there were, over 100 games, we got six. The long-term marketing impact of us hosting is really, I mean, I would say kind of dubious. And also there's, the question of whether it was worth spending that, 380 million, that's another question. And the other point that I've seen made is that if you're watching the World Cup in Toronto, for example, or frankly, the World Cup in Kansas City, and saying, I'd really like to go and do that next time. You're not saying, I'm going to go to San Diego or Kansas City or Toronto. You're saying you want to go to the next World Cup. The host is not the one that's really getting the benefit of that marketing glow and that destination marketing glow. It's event marketing. It's not destination marketing. It's the FIFAs of the world. It's the IOCs of the world. They're the only ones who are the real guaranteed winners in every single one of these.
And I think, Tim, to your point on, the debate of the economic impact of sports, there is an economic impact of sports. But the question is there an ROI based upon the public dollars put in, right? I think if this were all privately financed, we wouldn't be having this conversation now.
Well, I'm thinking, Josh, about the headline on one of your great pieces in the Toronto Star, which the first few words are, FIFA is no Taylor Swift, new data shows. Why the world, I'll just give everyone the rest, why the World Cup isn't delivering a massive economic boom for Toronto. And I mean, I read the piece, so I kind of know, but are we to assume, Taylor Swift just sold out a bunch of shows at Rogers Center. There's little to no public investment in that. Some of those fans would have been downtown anyway, most wouldn't. Hotels, restaurants, etc., were loaded up night after night while fans, including many I know, and sadly not me, showed up for Taylor Swift, right? That's a little different than the World Cup.
Absolutely. And part of it is seasonal. That was in November, right? Which is, let's be honest, in Western New York and Southern Ontario, that's not prime tourism season, right? Like I love the winter, but that's not where when people are booking conferences. So it's like down, off peak for tourism season around then. So, that made a big difference. So that was like, found money in terms of visitors coming to town. Also, she is a global phenomenon and kind of captures a market and captures audiences who really couldn't give a rodent's behind about sports of any kind. And the other thing is, we know that there's going to be another World Cup in 4 years. We know there's going to be another Euro Championship in 2 years. So, they are cyclical. We don't know when she's going to have another, insanely large world tour and, like setting up the royal wedding of North American celebrities, right? So it's more of a one-off type of thing, and it's a different crowd entirely.
Josh, anything anecdotal or quantifiable as far as the U.S. visitors coming up into Toronto and just, are we finally, at a point where we can start rebuilding those bridges between the border crossings and the international travel between our countries?
Well, there was a good bridge which just opened a little further down the way today, and the Gordie Howe Bridge. So I think in terms of ordinary citizens and, kind of, coming over for a couple of days to visit in the summer, I think it's slowly starting to trickle back. I mean, I've been spending quite a bit of time down in the Niagara region lately, and starting to see a few more New York State plates at at the winery tasting rooms. So, but there's some genuine hurt on this side of the fence, because of things that have been said. But we are still neighbors. I'm a big Buffalo booster. My mom's from Orchard Park. She grew up around 10 minutes drive from I would call it Rich Stadium back in the day. But so it's so there's so many connections between Western New York and Southern Ontario that I can't for the life of me think that this animus will last forever. But there's still a lot of people who are saying, we'll wait it out,
Yeah, well,
until and there's a change. So
yeah. Well, one of those license plates may have been my wife and I. We were up in Niagara on the Lake a few weeks back and had just a great, great visit. And by the way, everyone was very welcoming. So encouraged both sides to visit each other
Yeah,
going
and
forward.
Oh,
I've crossed the border constantly, and
And by the way, the wine's great too.
it
oh,
is.
absolutely. Let's face it, border towns on both sides of the border have been suffering
Yeah,
during a lot of this, and so I think it's good to kind of think of them as regional economies as well, and
absolutely.
regional because the trends are the same, right? So
Absolutely.
I was about to throw in that Tim Hortons is way better in Canada than Toronto, so that's that might be the most controversial thing said on this show today. But no, seriously, Josh, we're gonna have to wrap soon. But I want to ask you about the Buffalo and Toronto sports connection. It's something our friend Jack Armstrong. And I
Yeah.
have talked about, a bunch over the years. And I'm not sure if there's anyone listening to this who doesn't know Jack, but he is native of Brooklyn, a resident of Western New York, and an absolute icon in Canadian basketball. As a former college basketball coach and now a longtime Toronto Raptors analyst. And again, like the Don Cherry of basketball in Canada, I feel. He said to me years ago, and we still talk about it, that there could be and should be more of a Buffalo-Toronto sports corridor. And he's thinking football, and going in
Yeah.
both directions, getting more people from the New York side to go up and see Raptors games. Obviously, the Blue Jays and the Bisons being a Major League, minor league
Yeah.
affiliate.
That's helped a lot.
Yeah, it really has. And Josh, I'm just wondering what you see there and what are the untapped or underutilized opportunities to build that?
I think sports has been great for Toronto fans learning more about Buffalo and learning more about what Western New York has to offer. You talk about the Jays, that's one part of it. If you also think about the prohibitive cost of major league sports tickets, if you're like a family of four, it can be $1,000 night, like if you're looking at tickets and meals and, like parking and everything, and that's if you can even get tickets, for Raptors or Leafs, sometimes, or in seasons like last year for the Jays, like you can go across the border, have a night in another town, have some great meals, see some great architecture, go to the Albright Knox, like there's all these things that are there, and I think that's an opportunity. I mean, I know the Bills have done a very good job of reaching out across to Southern Ontario. I know that's frankly a huge part of their fan base and their season ticket base. I think the Jays, that's starting to be a more natural connection, for I think fans, who are real baseball nerds, say, oh my God, I could have seen Vladdy when he was in AAA. I
Right.
mean that's kind of a fun thing. Like I saw that guy, hitting home runs before it was cool to watch him hitting home runs. So I think, that type of direct connection, franchise to franchise, or, franchise deliberately marketing to the region like the Bills have done, I think I think that's a very real thing. But, just as I was talking about people on this side of the border, having some sore feelings given what's been going on now, politically and border wise and trade wise, I saw when there was all that talk of Rogers, looking at buying the Bills and moving them up here. I saw how angry and kind of viscerally people responded to that in Western New York. It's like, this is our Bills, man. Like, so I think there's a limit to how much you can push it as one big happy market, or, and because I think people would be a little suspicious and scared that, Rodgers might be coming around to take another sniff if they started pushing it too hard. But, I think Mr. Pegula has very strong roots and, 2.1 billion reasons to stay in Western New York for the foreseeable future.
Yeah,
so.
I think they're sticking around.
But Josh, you brought up the Canadian fans, Blue Jays fans, coming down for the Bison's games, and I know in a past episode we had Mike Buchkowski from the Bisons on. I think they're dependent on a good 20% of their ticket buyers to be coming down from Canada, and last we checked, that's not the numbers that are coming right now.
No, and it's similar. I mean, hockey, football, very, 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 similar. I don't know if I want to say dependency in the case of football, but it sure as heck makes a difference.
Well,
and
those Leafs fans still find a way to come
They
down.
absolutely do, and they should. You can pay a premium for Sabres tickets, and it's still got to be a lot cheaper. This has been great, though. So happy to have you here, Josh.
And Josh, next time when you're down in this neck of the woods visiting us or going to a Bison's game, come check in with us here at the studio.
Absolutely, would love to, guys. And next time you're up in Toronto, we'll have a beverage.
It'll be sooner than later.
The whiskey sounds good up there.
All right, sounds good.
Hey,
thanks,
Josh. Take care.
Well, thanks to both our guests, Tim, and great takeaways from both Angela as well as Josh. I think my biggest takeaway, just I guess something for our listeners to just contemplate, right? For example, in Toronto, an investment of $380 million. Was that the best place to invest those dollars? Or where else in the GTA could those dollars have been invested, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's schools, whether it's whatever, that may have had a more lasting impact? That's kind of the overriding question and takeaway I have.
And, something that we didn't get into too much with Josh here, but I think it's important for people to remember too, is something that another sports economist, Roger Knoll, guy from Stanford, legendary sports economist, told me back when I was covering those Bills Stadium negotiations. He essentially said, look, you've got to view these things like you're, building a park or a playground or, something that's not going to have a massive economic impact. And he was talking about football stadiums, but it adds to your quality of life.
Mm-hmm, right.
It makes you proud to live where you live. It gives you something to look forward to do. It's nice to have. And, whether it's an NFL team or the World Cup, although the World Cup comes and goes, it doesn't stay, that's part of the judgment you've got to make. Like, was it worth having, not only from a ROI, dollars and cents perspective, but just, civic pride or exposure for your city.
Right. Tough to quantify that. So while the jury is still out on the economics, and we will report as those numbers continue to come out and evolve, I think it's safe to say the one true winner, though, was the FIFA World Cup.
Absolutely. That is so true. And to close the loop on the Taylor Swift question, I do want to point this out. Yes, Taylor Swift was worth more, most likely, to Toronto than the World Cup. But notice, Toronto got both.
Right.
So they didn't lose anything, right?
Yeah.
That's not a bad way to come out of this.
Not a trade-off, right. Well, again, thank you to Angela Lee and Josh Rubin for joining us here on Skin in the Game. Until next week. Skin in the Game is a production of Buffalo Toronto Public Media. You can catch up with all past episodes on btpm.org or on the Buffalo Toronto Public Media YouTube channel. Thanks for listening.